Okay, let's begin. We're still on the topic of register, but here we're interested in the language of science. Today, this week and next week, we're talking about verbal art, verbal science. We'll begin with verbal science. There is a volume in Halliday's collected works. I'm the editor for the collected works. There's 11 volumes. One of the volumes is the language of science. Halliday did a great deal of work in this area. He was very fascinated in what led up to the nature of discourse that is used in science, that is used in academia or academic writing. What has evolved as the scaffolding for scientific knowledge is a dedicated semiotic system, a special register of a language. What he's suggesting is that when you look at the language of science, you see that those that were doing science developed new strategies for being able to make meaning. New ways of organizing the grammar as a resource for making meaning. He changed the language. Scientists made use of pre-existing resources to create a discourse that moves forward by logical, coherent steps, each building on what has gone before. So what he's suggesting here is, and what is illustrated here, and I've mentioned it to you before. Do you remember when we talked about grammatical metaphor? Grammatical metaphor was what? That was where we said verbs very often are changed into nouns. So that when we look at the solvent tends to be drawn through the membrane into the solution, thus diluting it. We're looking at language that is basically verbal. Verbal in the sense of using verbs. Drawn through, diluting it. It's all the actions that are taking place. But notice then, in the next sentence at the beginning, all of that is repackaged into a nominalization that occurs as the subject and as what we call theme. Movement of the solvent across the membrane. Taking a happening described in very dynamic terms, using verbs, using processes, and changing that into a something, a noun, fix, which now can be talked about. It's this repackaging that is called a grammatical metaphor. Turning verbs into nouns. Where did that come from? Well, in Western English, Western discourse, I should say, not just English, the early Greeks provided an idea, and that idea was the potential of deriving from the lexical stem of one word another word of a different class. Transcategorizing potential. In other words, that we can change verbs and adjectives into nouns. And then they become these abstract entities like motion, weight. They're generalizations, they're abstractions. All right. Well, the Greeks were doing this. And another thing the Greeks were also doing was extending the nominal group with embedded clauses and prepositional phrases. And the very kind of thing that we've been looking at in that judge's summation, when we said that there were these embedded clauses that extended the noun phrase. You know why scientific writing, academic writing, has a large lexical density? Why? Because we tend to put all of that into noun phrases. We package what would usually be in a clause with an actor or agent doing something, we repackage it all as one long noun phrase that can go on and on and on, embedding clause after another, adding a prepositional phrase. Well, when do we see this happening in the language of science, in English? We can go back to Newton. And specifically this work by Sir Isaac Newton, Optics. We begin to see it in the language of Newton, of Darwin, all of this work that was being done in science in the 18th century. In optics, he begins with a description of his experiment. Now, that is described in very sort of verbal terms, verbs. Step one, do this. Step two, do that, and so on. That's the beginning. But then he begins to conclude and make arguments on the basis of what he discovered from these experiments. And here is where we begin to see nominalizations, grammatical metaphor. And then he went on finally to conclude with his mathematical formulations. Clause simplexes. Now, what is that? It's a way of saying a simple clause. Just a simple clause, one clause only, A equals X, where A and X are lexically dense nominal groups. What does that look like? It looks like this. The education of girls preceded the acquisition of the vote by women. The education of girls, that's one nominalization, it's the subject. The acquisition of the vote by women, that's A, that's X, and what's the equal sign? What joins them? What relates them? What relates them is not a conjunction. So we package all the actions that we want to talk about, and we want to be able to look at them in terms of a lexically dense nominal group, two participants joined by one clause, by one verb, making up one clause. So Halliday says this: by the end of the 18th century, this practice of nominalizing the experiential context, using the verbal group to signal the logical relation, using the verb to signal the logical relation, so that A causes X, or A proves Y, or A precedes X. This has emerged as the most highly valued model of scientific writing. But when we say scientific writing, let's be clear. It may begin in the language of science, but it permeates all of academic discourse. When you write your essays, when you write in an academic setting, this is the way you write. So the question could be asked, why? Why did they move in this direction? Because it makes it so much more complicated. Not only are those nominalizations so lexically dense, because you package several things happening into one something, it's difficult to read. Why did they do it? Why did scientific writers from Isaac Newton onwards increasingly favor such a mode of expression? One in which, instead of writing, this happened, so that happened, they write, this event caused this event. Halliday's point is it wasn't purposeful. It wasn't deliberate. Not like Newton and Darwin and all these guys who sat down together and decided this is how we're going to write from now on. Newton and his contemporaries were not aware of their own use of grammar, and these forms evolved naturally in response to the pressure from the discourse, the need. The need, what's the need? The need is to be able to take something, package it in such a way that the dynamic becomes the static. And when it is static, you can measure it. When it is fixed, you can describe it, you can measure it, you can quantify it. But when it's an action that is dynamic, you can't hold it still. So that's why you need to take the verb and turn it into a noun. You take the dynamic, you turn it into the static. You turn something that is moving into movement. And you can describe it, measure it. That's what science does. Newton and his successors were creating a new variety of English for a new kind of knowledge. Kind of knowledge in which experiments were carried out. General principles derived by reasoning from these experiments with the aid of mathematics, and these principles in turn tested by further experiments. So Halliday's point is this: our potential for making meaning is never exhausted. As the nature of scientific inquiry changes and the discourse evolves to keep pace with those changes, and here's a critical line, we can anticipate new ways of meaning in the language of science. He's not going to say, what he's saying is that it's not fixed. It's going to change. It's going to evolve. And one of the pressures I do think that's coming in the language of science is that it is so difficult to read. It is so complex. You have to. That difficulty is something that writers now want to overcome. Less nominalization, less complex clauses. Why? To make it more readable. So you see, there's another pressure from another side. As the need arose for more powerful and abstract theories of experience, humankind has been empowered by the metaphor-making potential of language. What's the metaphor-making potential? The matter. Why is it a metaphor? Because it isn't the literal. If I'm going to take a process and I'm going to describe it literally, the straightforward, the direct way is a verb. But I don't do that. Instead, I use a noun. So I'm doing something different. And that noun, what does it give to the verb? What does it give to the process, I should say? It gives it that quality of nounness. What is nounness? Fixed, static, controllable. I didn't read that line. To reconstrue common sense reality into one that imposed regularities on experience and brought the environment more within our power. It's something that we can use. We have a new way of meaning. And that new way of meaning gives us a new way of speaking, a new way of communicating. Now, it's not just turning verbs into nouns. I don't want you to think that. It's more than that. Its classes are shifted sideways. Verbs and adjectives become nouns. Conjunctions become verbs. It's a whole configurational change. And instead of having complex clauses, we turn it into simple clauses. Now, that is the odd part of it. You turn it into something that is grammatically simple. By doing what? Making the nominalizations so dense. So on one hand, you've taken complex clauses that go on and on. And you, instead of having clauses that go on and on, you now, that are conjoined by conjunctions, you now have them said as one compact, simple clause. On one hand, it's simple, but on the other hand, it's so complicated. It's complicated because you move the complication into a whole nother spectrum, out of the clause into the noun phrase. And so instead of complex clauses, we have simple clauses. Instead of clauses, they become noun phrases. Halliday likes to use the term groups, right? I don't know in your linguistics what you've heard, but Halliday calls a noun phrase, he calls this a noun group, right? That's what he's referring to. And so this is the example. I've given it to you before. We call this the congruent. What's congruent? Congruent means straightforward, direct. That's how you talk when you grew up, all right? The educated girls. That's a clause. Women acquired the vote. Clause. And how are those two ideas related? And then. So we have a conjunction, combines the two clauses. But the whole thing can now be repackaged as the education of girls, a nominalization, followed by a verb that does the work of the conjunction, preceded the acquisition of the vote by women. We turn it into an event. Halliday, I think I mentioned this the last time, calls this de-automatization. What does he mean by that? He means by that is the literal and the way we use verbs to represent processes and all like that. This, for example, if I can go back, just slide. This is the simple. It is the straightforward. It is the congruent. It's the automatic. It's the default. It's the default way of talking. But then we go against the default. What the language of science did was it de-automatized, went against the default. It changed the default. These instances of de-automatization involving grammatical metaphor reoccur with such an intensity that the shifts eventually become a drift in the direction of a nominalizing grammar. In other words, the grammar is highly nominalized. The idea that what is being said and all those shifts that we just talked about, they become so frequent, they become the norm. They become the new automatic. They become the drift. Halliday's analyses of scientific discourse reveals a broad form grammatical drift that creates a novel intensity in the way writers in English construe experience. You remember this? We talked about sort of this realization, the instances of language like we see in the text in Parole. At the other end of this continuum is the system of language, the long, remember, and we describe this as a kind of continuum of instantiation. I think now hopefully you can begin to see it. The instances of language, this repetition of uses of nominalization, reoccurring with such an intensity, the shifts become the drift. They become the new automatic. They become the system of language. They become the way we talk. The shift becomes a drift. There has been a steady drift in the grammar of scientific discourses toward things. We see the world as things. And our language is moving us in that direction. Things have been foregrounded at the expense of qualities, processes, relations. You see the world as things. In other words, that new way of being that became a new way of speaking has become a new ideology. It becomes the way we think. How has it affected us in terms of the way we perceive the world? If the way we write is all within, not as dynamic actions that are carried out, but rather as so. Well, what's the outcome of that? Ideationally, the nominalizing grammar creates a universe of things, bounded, stable, determinate, and in place of processes of relations between the things. It's a new idea, a new way of thinking, a new way of seeing the world. But there's another aspect to this, and that is interpersonal. What has it done to our language? It sets itself apart as a discourse of the expert, readily becoming a language of power and technocratic control. How are you going to succeed? How do you succeed in your university study? You cannot unless you master the language. And by that, I don't mean the language. I mean the way of speaking, like academics, like the language of science. It sets itself up as sort of an elite because we control the way one is able to communicate in a way that they will be accepted. So if you write a journal paper and try to submit that without using the language of science, you'll be rejected. You see, even if it doesn't really seem to be all that, what should I say, sensible, that all of academic discourse, and again, if we're honest, if you're writing a report for business, if you are writing anything that is kind of written report, whether it's not just the sciences, it's all academic discourse, it's the language of government, it's the language of bureaucracy, it is the language of business, and that is the way you get educated means learning the language, learning the way of speaking. That is one outcome of it. In both aspects, it creates a maximum distance between technical scientific knowledge and the experience of daily life. How removed are we from actually daily life, how we experience in the way we write? That's verbal science. Now let's go to verbal art. You know, one book that influenced me a lot was this book, Linguistics, Language, and Verbal Art. It's written by Ruqayya Hassan. Who's Ruqayya Hassan? She is the wife of Aladdin. Okay. Someone he credits as being a major influence in his life. Okay. But this book was also very much influenced me. You know, I must admit, when I grew up, even when I was at university, I wasn't fond of poetry at all. You asked me to, read poetry. I wasn't interested. I didn't like it. I thought it was okay, nice sounding words, okay. There's not that much to it. Okay. I read this book and I began to approach it as a linguist. And it opened my eyes to see that what is verbal art is indeed art. And what's the art? The art is the use of language. Verbal art, she says, serves as a vehicle for what she calls second order semiosis. What's semiosis? Semiosis is a more complicated way of saying making meaning. Okay? A vehicle for making second order. In other words, not the literal, the metaphoric. Turning the meanings of language into signs having a deeper meaning. Where does the deeper meaning come from? What she's suggesting is that we take language. This is language. This is the way we use language. We'll call it the verbalization. It is the semantics, the lexical grammar, the phonology, the way we use language. And what we do is we articulate symbols. We articulate metaphors. How do we do that? With this. What we do, and how it's done, is to take the habitual patterns of grammatical choice. What's the habitual patterns of grammatical choice? Think about that. I want you to sort of unpack it. Habitual pattern, the way you use language, normal. And turn it into a non-habitual consistency. What's a consistency? Pattern. Something that occurs frequently. What she's saying is, it is basically just taking the way we normally use language, but then we use it within the novel, within the poem, or within whatever literary work. And the artist creates a pattern that is the nature of that text. It is the texture of the text. Mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice into a non-habitual consistency, a specific patterning specific to the text. Once you've done that, once you've identified within the work, within the verbal, within the piece of art, a pattern that you see, you break the pattern. You go against the pattern. Again, it's the same idea of de-automatize. You go against it. You break it. And when you break it, the attention of the reader, the listener, is captured. We're drawn to the foregrounding. We're drawn to what stands out. We're drawn to what's different. So there's this foregrounding. Now, what's the purpose of foregrounding? Because the artist has a theme. Now, theme here is not at all like Halliday's idea of theme, what occurs initially in the pulse. Okay? Theme here is in the very literary sense, the motif, an idea. So what is the writer doing? The writer is trying to grab your attention, get your attention, and from there, draw out, get you to think what the writer is trying to tell. And this theme is a hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. It's a hypothesis. It's a theory. What you're trying to do is come up with basically a theory about what is the writer's theory. The writer has an idea. That's where it's the art, okay? The writer doesn't come to it with no purpose. The writer has a purpose. The purpose is to convey to you a message. And what is the message that the writer is trying to convey to you? The writer is conveying it to you in that foregrounded part of whatever the work was. Foregrounded against what? The background that the artist created, the pattern that the artist created, and then breaks it to get your attention. And here's what I'm telling you. Russell Mears, remember I've mentioned him before. He is the Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry at University of Sydney. I mentioned him before. Very interestingly, he has this book. He loves poetry. And he has this book, The Poet's Voice in the Making of Mind. Here's another work that really impressed. All right. He says this: the words of a poet are used in a symbolic way. That goes to Hassan's symbolic articulation, articulating a symbol, having more than a single meaning. A reference to travel may be referred to the journey of life. That's an obvious one. The effect of a few simple words combined in a particular way is to evoke a sense of reality that none of them possess alone. The nature of this reality is not precise. It is indefinite. A poem creates a mood, as music does, which is hard to exactly pin down to express in words. Poetry is a kind of music. And like a piece of music, it conveys and evokes the emergent feeling it seeks to represent. This music will be that of a distilled and refined form conversation.
Amen. It's been useful because I now see the structure of mind as like the structure of a poem.
Yes. Would you say it's a healing prospect for you?
I would say yes, yeah, absolutely. And I became particularly interested in a called Wallace Stevens. There's a kind of not very well known poet, but amongst critics, he's regarded as one of the three great poets of the English language in the 20th century. And he basically admitted that writing poetry in his life was for and had a healing purpose. It was a therapeutic function.
A therapeutic function. But very interestingly, Hassan says much the same thing. She talks about the sociotherapeutic, eco-linguistic function of the study or reading of literature. She puts it like this: to make readers more human than they were before they came to read that literature. To really change people's perspective. That being, that hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man, that is, by paying attention to it, something which she suggests may make us more human than we were before we came to read that literature.
Well, I was always interested in literature. And I can find that I think my own study is that's everything. And after that, I think I went to the study because I was convinced that I really something that I really focused on that literature, the picture of it is a good study. That it could make the readers more human than they are before they came to that. So I've always felt that you could really change people's perspective on things by teaching literature properly.
So the idea is what? The artist creates a background that is a consistency of patterning, that is just the way, just using the normal resources of language, but patterning it in such a way that is specific to that text, and then being able to foreground against that to highlight the theme, this theme that is supposed to serve this hopefully therapeutic function. De-automatization. Hassan calls it foregrounding. Halliday liked the term de-automatization. You see, Halliday's idea was, you know what's, he's saying this, what happens in verbal art And what happens in verbal science is the same thing. It is this ability to create the metaphor. It is this ability to de-automatize, to be able to do the adjacent possible, the something different. This is the basis of creativity in verbal art. It is the basis of innovation in science. So it's one thing, it's one phenomenon. He prefers Mukarovsky's term de-automatization to foregrounding, since, as he puts it, what is in question is not simply prominence, it's not just simply foregrounding, it's not just simply getting your attention, but rather it's done by freeing the lower level systems. What's the lower level systems? Freeing the grammar from the control of the semantics. As though grammar is linked to semantics, but breaking that link and linking it another way. To de-automatize means to try to interpret the grammar in terms that go beyond its direct realization function. So it's about artistically creating an automatization, a background against which to de-automatize, create a pattern in order to break the pattern. So then the question I'm going to ask is, how can we actually distinguish what is an intentional act of de-automatization of format? How do we know it's really art, not accident? Okay. The occurrence of a particular linguistic phenomenon whose prominence, though perhaps statistically demonstrable, nevertheless is not part of the artist's craft, does not contribute to the overall meaning of the work of the art. How do you know that it is intention? It is art. It's not accident. How can you tell? Foregrounding of a pattern depends on two things: contrast and consistency. We're going to begin by looking at contrast. But I think before we do that, let's take a break. And if we could come back at around 9 or thereabouts. Okay.